Hello, good evening. Welcome to Live Irish Myths. We have a very special guest tonight. None other than the author, Morgan Daimler, who will be joining us to talk about fairy lore and in particular the evolution of fairy stories from the older myths about the deities. This, I think, is going to be an interesting one. I wonder, are we live? Is everybody okay? Yeah, we're okay. We're good. I was going to suggest tonight that we skip the hellos and introductions to try and give maximum time to Morgan. So the way I was going to propose that we'd work this is live TV after all, was that I'm going to introduce Morgan, I'm going to ask her a couple of questions. And I would prefer if Morgan did a lot of the talking in this one. YouTubers, you will not be able to see Morgan. She's only going to appear for the Facebookers. I'm hoping that we will be able to hear her properly, that the microphone from the webcam is very close to the phone here, and that her audio will carry over. If that turns out not to be the case, I apologize. This is the limitation of my technical ability at this moment. Anyway, let me just see if I can... let me see if I can add Morgan into the broadcast. She's not visible just yet. It sometimes takes a couple of minutes. We were speaking to each other there a couple of moments ago on Facebook messaging. Yeah, here we go. Okay, I can't press add yet. This happened when we did the test. The names move around. So there's a couple of people there with add beside them, but you're not one of them, Morgan. So we'll just give it a moment. And I hope everybody's keeping safe and well. During the current pandemic, the situation, of course, continues here in Ireland. We are still having fatalities, unfortunately. The number of cases is very low, thankfully. And the lockdown has been eased dramatically. Still waiting for Morgan's name to have the word add beside it. Very strange. It's teasing me. There's 4 people at the top with add beside their name. Morgan, you're not one of them. Okay. This is going to take a moment. This is the way it was the other day. It just didn't take this long. Nope, still not happening. Okay. Well, let me just prattle on there and then for a few moments. We have had 4 episodes of fairy stories from Thomas Crofton Croker and from W.B. Yeats, etc., and from Douglas Hyde. So we're well versed at this stage, I hope. I can't. Yeah, there's people at the top, and I can't add. Hang on, till I just see if I can tap Morgan and see if I can add her. No, I can't. This is embarrassing. There's no doubt about it. Give me 1 second. I'm consulting my technical gurus here. That's what I'm doing. The technical gurus are currently assisting with the situation. If anybody, by the way, knows how this is, how do I force somebody to the top of the ad list? This is knowledge that I do not have. Yes, Paula says, have a word with the fairies. Would it help with those at the top went out? Yes. So just for a moment. There we go. Yes, hopefully. Morgan accepts the invitation. All should be good momentarily. It says adding. Connecting. Aha.
Sorry about that.
I believe we have success. Morgan, good evening.
Hi. Yeah, apparently my laptop is not letting you add me on my laptop, so I'm going to have to do this on my phone again.
Okay. Well, I hope that's not too inconvenient. Fingers crossed. Perhaps if the YouTubers could just comment whether they can hear Morgan properly. There isn't a huge amount I can do about it, but I might be able to move the webcam a little bit closer to the speaker. Anyway, I'm going to... Oh, yes. Sorry. I need to keep an eye on the questions. Right. Anyway, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Following the technical hitches, Morgan is here finally, thankfully. We'll give you a moment to sort out your phone there. Morgan Daimler needs no introduction. She is an author par excellence who has produced no fewer than 30 works, and people thought that my output was prolific. I fade into the shadows in comparison to this lady. Morgan has written quite an amount about fairy lore and Irish fairy stories, but also about the early deities, and so is somewhat of an expert in both subjects. Now, a while back, it was suggested to us that we do an episode based around the theme of how the fairy stories sort of emerged, perhaps from beliefs in the earlier deities. So that is going to be sort of the core subject to kick things off. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Morgan a couple of questions and warm up the situation. And then I'm going to take a note of questions that you might have pertaining to the fairies and the mythology. If we can try and stick to the subject as closely as possible, that would make life easier. And I'm hoping that Morgan will, in fact, do most of the talking. So, Morgan, to kick off the session, I suppose it would be beneficial for me and for the viewers to find out how exactly did you become interested in Irish fairy stories? When did that begin? And could tell us a little bit about it.
It's pretty much been a lifelong thing for me since I was very small. I used to hear, certain stories and certain folk practices were passed down through the family. I sort of grew up and live in the Irish American diaspora, so it's that sort of second generation removed beliefs over here. But that's what got me interested in studying and seeing what the beliefs were and the practices were in Ireland, what the source was, if you will.
Yeah.
So I started actively studying it probably when I was a teenager. And then when I got into my 20s and so on, got much more interested in it, much more in depth with it, if you will.
Okay. I'm just taking a note. Do you think it's unusual that, let's say, belief in the fairies continued with the diaspora when they were in other countries? That is something we've sort of explored in a couple of episodes where we found indications or examples of Irish myths that were still being told in, for instance, Nova Scotia, Labrador, Newfoundland, where those same myths weren't really commonplace here anymore. For instance, the belief in Sheila and St. Sheila's Day, which had all but passed out of memory after the famine here. What is it about that that makes the belief and the memory stick with people? What do you think about that?
I think, there's certainly some people who leave Ireland voluntarily because they want to, but I think a lot of people ended up leaving, particularly some of the older generation when they were younger, because they felt like they didn't have a choice. So over here, there's a lot of people who are here that still have that sort of longing and desire to be where they started out, as it were, and that gets passed on to the later generations. And I think that's kind of a driving force in the people who do come here in the other diasporic communities, wanting to preserve whatever they can of their heritage and their beliefs. my grandfather was from Cork City originally, and he was the one when I was younger who he passed it on to the family and to my father and to me that if you're drinking outside, you always pour the first little bit out for the good people on the ground because that's their due. It belongs to them. And things like that are just things that I think people feel like if you let go of those beliefs, then you're really letting go of where you came from, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. When did you sort of first become aware of the possibility that those stories emanated from something older, or was that something that was always sort of plainly obvious?
I think when I started really looking into it, probably when I was a teenager, my best friend growing up was actually from Ireland. She moved here when she was 6, from Connemara. And so I think that also sort of helped me make that connection and that realization that, there was more to it than just what we have over here in the communities over here. And it got me really looking at where things came from and where they were as a still living belief and living practice. Because obviously everything's not in the past. Yeah.
Two questions that are sort of related, and I have taken note of 2 or 3 questions there. I'm just saying to the people who are viewing, if you have questions related to the fairies, please feel free to ask, and I will put those questions to Morgan. There's 2 questions about time, and the first is when do you think that? How far back can we trace fairy stories in Ireland? I know that's probably a tough question, and the other one is, it seems that the belief in the fairies in particular waned considerably in Ireland around the first half of the 20th century. I wonder if you have an explanation for that, other than the long accepted or the much preferred suggestion that rural electrification, the electrification of towns and villages, caused the belief to wane. So sorry, that was two questions, throwing them at you.
That's okay. The first one I actually can answer pretty directly. We have written evidence of the Aishi, the people of the fairy mounds, going back to about the 5th to 7th century.
Oh, right.
So it goes back really far. If we just look at it purely from a mythological written material direction, there's an account in some of the stories with St. Patrick, preserved by I believe it was a bishop named Tirichan. And he writes about Patrick being by Cruachan and encountering these 2 princesses who were bathing. And there's this whole story. I won't get into that entire story. But as part of it, when he's talking to them, when Patrick is talking to these...
we appear to have little glitch there. We lost you for a moment. You might just repeat the last sentence.
He asks them, who they are. And they initially, when they see him and his retinue, think that he's a man of the Sidhe. So they say to him, effectively, like, are you one of the Fairies, or are you a man of the Sidhe? And then in questioning him sort of about his faith, they express that, they have this belief in the beings of the fairy mounds, the beings of the Sidhe, who are connected to the gods of the air and the earth and the water. And it's a really interesting passage. It doesn't get into too much more depth than that about the Aishi, the fairies, but it's a very early passage, and it was preserved by a Christian in a Christian account. So it's not meant to be preserved as folklore per se. It was more part of the account of them dealing with these 2 pagans, who of course eventually convert in the story. But that's one of the older ones. And then we have the Extra Kantha, which is the oldest sort of explicitly fairy story in the Irish corpus. And that one dates to, I believe, the 9th century in writing, but it's estimated to be between the 5th and 7th based on the language that's used in it, which we see with a lot of the manuscripts. The actual date we have for the in writing is usually a little older than they believe the story itself probably is. And the Conla is the son of the king Con, and he and his father and an assembly of his father's people are standing on a hill when a woman of the Sidhe, a fairy woman, comes to him, and he starts talking to her. Nobody else can see her in the story, only him. But when he starts to talk to her, his father naturally asks him, who are you speaking to?
Yeah.
And then she explains that she is from the East Sidhe. She actually says she lives in the Sidhe Moor, the Great Fairy Hill. And she wants Conla to go with her, to join her among her people. His father is not keen on that idea, and his father's druid uses some magic to kind of force her to leave, but she gives Conla an apple. He eats nothing but the apple for a month, and no matter how much he eats it, it always remains full. And then she returns after a month, and he does end up leaving with her. They get on a boat and sail away to go join the people of the Sidhe. And that's the oldest, I believe, written record in Western Europe of the fairies.
That's very interesting that there are echoes there of, we were reading last week, Altron Chia Gavatar, about the house of the fosterage, the houses of the fosterage of the 2 drinking vessels. And Ethna, only drinks the milk from the cow that was brought from India. She won't eat any of the Dé Danann food. And of course, this is a Christian account because she basically converts to Christianity and she goes off. But she becomes invisible, doesn't she? And I just wonder about this whole idea of invisibility, whether that doesn't, is that one of the things that ties the fairy beliefs into the Dé Dananns, the fact that there was this Vet Féada, or the idea that, they could basically choose whether to be visible or invisible to mortals.
Yeah, and which is something, as you know from that story, that that source says Manannán taught them. That when they went into the Sidhe, Manannán was the one who taught them how to survive there and how to use the Fithea and stay immortal and all of that. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting thing to look at and contemplate how that connects in. That we can't see them if they don't want to be seen. But,
yeah. Okay, so I've got 7 or 8 questions here from the audience, so I suppose I'll just throw a few of those out, and we'll see where we go with the discussion. Longti Menosi asks, is it a presupposition that the Tuatha Dé Danann predate fairies? Which is an interesting question.
It is, and probably to many people's surprise, in the written accounts, the fairies predate the Tuatha Dé Danann. But we don't know if that actually means that the fairies were there first. What we have in the written record is the 5th and 7th century accounts of the people of the Sidhe, without mentions of the Tuatha Dé Danann. We don't have stories that date back that far that mention the Tuatha Dé Danann at all. That comes in more 9th, 10th century. And it's possible that it's because the belief in the East Sidhe does predate the stories that we have about the Tuatha Dé Danann as they are in the written material. It's also possible that the earlier material just doesn't mention them because the earlier material was written by people who were very Christian and very aware of the paganism being so recent, so we don't see it until later. I think more what he's specifically referencing here, because I could nerd out about literature in mythology endlessly.
Nerd away.
Because we have the accounts of the Aes very early in the written material, and we have the accounts of the Tuatha Dé Danann coming in a couple hundred years later, there are references to the Aes in the stories of the Tuatha Dé Danann, which are supposed to take place before humans have come to Ireland, and ergo before the Tuatha have been driven into the Sidhe. It's possible it's anachronism. And it's an anachronism because of the way that the dates the stories were written down in. We can never know for certain exactly how the beliefs worked at the time. But we do have references to the riders of the Sidhe and the Aes in like the Leabhar Érenn, the Cathmoistera, stories that kind of tell the original placement of the Tuatha Dé Danann when they first came to Ireland, before they were in the mounds.
Yeah.
So it's.
I'm wondering, am I the only one who's having that momentary? That's the second time. It's only just a brief. You froze for a moment.
I probably should have said before we did this that every single time ever that I have talked about this subject on any sort of technological format, I always end up with these weird, inexplicable tech issues.
Yep, that's the way it happens. So, folks, if it happens, you'd have a good idea why it happens. Morgan, if you don't mind, there's another very good question there. It's from Alex Casterton. I have a related question in my mind. Alex asks, would you class the Dark Fae as Fomorians? I was going to ask, do you think the fact that the fairies can be so troublesome relates to the fact that they look at us as Milesian? If we can relate fairies to the Dé Dananns, we're the ones who took the surface world away from them. Is that perhaps the reason? But I suppose the two questions are kind of one question, really.
And I would say yes to both of them. There's an interesting comment in Mark Williams' book, Ireland's Immortals. And I believe he's quoting someone else, but I can't remember who he's quoting. Apologies offhand. But he basically says that the fairies have always been whoever the previous group of inhabitants were. So the fairies for the Tuatha Dé Danann were the Fomorians and the Fir Bolg. And we do see some support of that in the Cathmoistera when Bresh gets ousted as the king and he goes to his Fomorian father. He does ask for the riders of the Sidhe, and it explicitly says the riders of the Sidhe, that is, the warriors of the Fomorians. So this kind of idea that it's a very complicated, nuanced world, and you have multiple types of beings that fall under that term of Aes Sidhe. I would say there's definitely truth to that. And to the second part, the idea that they caused humans problems because of the Gaels taking Ireland and forcing the Tuatha Dé Danann out, I would definitely say that there's support for that. In the another version of the story of the taking of the Sidhe, the really good one where Angus ends up tricking Elchmar to get Sidhe and Broga. At the beginning, it talks about how the Tuatha Dé Danann have been driven into the Sidhe, and when they first take Ireland, when the Gaels first take Ireland, their crops won't grow, their cows won't give milk, and they're basically having major problems. And they end up going to Dagda and sort of creating this friendship, this compact with him, with the understanding that if they give a portion of their harvest, a portion of the grain and a portion of the milk, to the Tuatha Dé Danann, who are now the Aes Sidhe, then they will have crops and their cows will give milk and everything will run more smoothly. And this is a belief that we see in later folklore. Marion McNeill talks about this in her book, Festival of Lunasa. In later folklore, this exact same idea is attributed completely to the fairies. The idea that a tithe of the crops are owed to the fairies, or they'll cause you problems and mischief, and sometimes more than mischief.
Yeah.
So I definitely think there's an aspect of that.
I've seen that in Laura Gawala, where the Dagda still causes trouble for the Milesians in terms of the crops until they kind of reach some sort of an agreement. There's a question on YouTube from Irish Technical Thinker. He says, why are the fairies here in Ireland? Why do they prefer to inhabit trees? And they like to select hawthorn and blackthorn. Do you know anything about, why that may be? And the whole suspicion about not interfering with I think it's the hawthorn tree in particular, isn't it? That there's a very great superstition around that you shouldn't touch it or great harm will come to you.
Yep. There is some folklore attached to the blackthorn, specifically that it has a type of guardian Lunatashi, a guardian spirit to it. But usually it's the hawthorn. It's explicitly the hawthorn. Not every single hawthorn in existence. Like hawthorn hedgerows, you're generally fine with. It's the lone hawthorn in the field by itself. I think that kind of reflects the idea that even though we tend to use the term she and we tend to think of them as the people of the fairy mounds and associate them very much with the fairy hills, the old Raths and the Lish and all that, what we actually see when we look at the folklore and the older belief is a much more complicated idea. Yes, they're connected to the fairy mounds, but they're also connected to islands in the west, multiple islands, otherworldly islands. And the idea that they're connected to the trees, and the trees are this sort of gateway for them, that they can use the tree to pass in and out of our world. I think it's all layered into that really old 7th century Christian account, which talks about the two pagan girls saying that their gods exist in the sky and the land and the sea. There's multiple doorways into the other world in folklore and mythology. Yeah. Why specifically the hawthorn? I don't think I know, but
I heard a theory about that once, that it's got to do with there's some chemical in hawthorn that in the flower of the hawthorn, you're not supposed to. Some people believe that it's bad luck to bring it indoors at a certain time of the year. Is it Bealtaine? And that the reason for that is because it actually has the same scent as a rotting corpse, something along those lines. That there's a chemical in the hawthorn flower that arouses this whole sense of being in the presence of death. That is what I read. I can't tell you where I read it. It might have been in one of Niall McCutcher's books about trees. I can't remember exactly where. Bernie Courtney, I have to read Bernie's comment. My grandparents were very committed and sincere Catholics, but their belief in and respect for the other world of fairies and she was absolutely resolute. They were offended if it was put down as folklore or pishogues. And I suppose that leads into the question around belief in the fairies. You've probably found, Morgan, as I have, that when you go asking, people deny, but secretly they'll say, the greatest answer I ever heard to the question, do you believe in the fairies, is, no, I don't. But sure, they're there anyway, Perhaps you might address that, the whole idea of the separate faith, as it were, in parallel with your Catholic faith, that people still believed in these beings, and not just believed in them, but they were actually very real for them. Is that not a bit strange?
I think it depends on how we're looking at the concept of belief here. There's belief as in you believe in something that you've never seen or experienced, but you have faith that it's there. And then there's belief because you feel like you have had an experience, or you have seen something, or you know someone that has. And, I think particularly when we talk about the fairies, there's often this tendency to treat them as if they're something of the past. And I think we had skipped over, someone had asked about why the belief had kind of waned in the 19th century. We should remember to get back to that in a second. But I think when you have people who feel like they have had something inexplicable happen to them, or they know someone who they trust or care about who has something inexplicable happen to them, that they attribute to the good folk. It's hard not to believe in it when it seems to have a concrete reality to it, for you and for your experiences. And I think a lot more people probably have anecdotal accounts and just don't want to talk about them. That's been my experience, is that when you ask people initially, they'll be like, no, like you said, no, I don't believe in that, but I still wouldn't mess with that hawthorn tree, or I still wouldn't go to that place. But then eventually they'll come around and be like, well, actually there was this time when I was, whatever age, and this very strange thing happened to me, and I can't explain it, but I think it was the fairies, so I don't want to mess with that.
Yeah, there are people who see them and for whom they're very real. What about and I'll get back, there are more questions. What about the people who see fairy lights? And this is something we've been reading several fairy stories about ring forts or rats and castles that suddenly at midnight are full of light, sometimes dancing lights, and all these merry little people dancing around. I wonder where does the whole idea of light come from? There was a fairy, sort of a story of a troublesome fairy in Drogheda who was trying to get people to look at the light in Millmount, which is one of the things I wrote about in Island of the Setting Sun, because I was convinced, and I still am, that Millmount is in fact the mound upon which the Martello Tower sits, is a passage tomb going back to the Neolithic. But I wonder, is there something there in relation to the lights that is explainable? And also, does that tie into my earlier question about the fading of the I suppose the fading of the belief in the fairies as especially the rural areas were electrified?
I think that we have accounts of lights being associated with fairies that go quite far back. Not in the mythology per se, but in the recorded folklore. Lights dancing on Benvolvin. Lights, travelers see them at night particularly. Yeah. Different types of fairy lights. I suspect the euphemism, the shining ones, probably comes from this idea of lights being connected to them. But we don't really have anything explicit that explains it. And sometimes the lights are harmless and sometimes the lights are dangerous. We do have accounts of people encountering lights that were intentionally trying to lead them astray, or indicating bad things. So
we could get into discussion of UFOs there, but I think we better not, because I know that there's a sort of a connection that's been written about there. Just a few quick questions from some of the viewers. Thanks, Morgan. Really enjoying this discussion, by the way. Fairies have control over iron. Why is this, asks Mello Nello, whose name is Neil, and Neil is in France.
Control over?
Yeah, that's what he said.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with the idea of them having control over iron. Just ignore my phone ringing.
Wasn't there something about metal though that repels them or something? Or
yes, iron wards them off. They're kind of known to be.
That's the fairies ringing.
They have opinions about iron.
No control, says Neil. Sorry, his question was, why do they have no control over? Thank you for correcting me, Neil, and my apologies.
Okay. Yeah, if you can ignore
we'll ignore
telemarketer in the back. Yeah. It's a very, very old idea that fairies are warded off or averse to iron, particularly in Ireland, but we kind of see it all over the place, all the way to like Norway and Scandinavia, Iceland. Just this very widespread belief that the fairies are averse to iron, that they can't stand that particular metal, and that you can use it to ward them off. This is another one of those things where in folklore and in the older stories, it's just taken as something that everyone would know. So when it's referenced, there's no attempt to explain it. The oldest reference that we have is about 2,000 years old. It's a Roman writer, Pliny the Elder, who talks about specifically the Gauls, that they would never harvest plants for magical or ritual uses with an iron blade because they believed that the iron would drive out the spirit. So that kind of hints at how long this belief has been around. In modern terms, there's a lot of theories. Iron is used to ward against fairies, against demons, against ghosts, against witches. It just seems to be something that protects against a diverse array.
Oh, we have completely lost Morgan. Oh dear. We will try to regain the situation momentarily. I'll just send her a message there. Please forgive me, folks. That is live TV, as I'm always saying. She's on the list, but I can't add her there. Yes. Give me a moment, please. Okay. Pat Rowan, I wonder if you would disconnect for a moment. There's 3 people at the top of the list, and I think if one of you disconnect, I might be able to get Morgan in. Apologies about that, Pat, if you wouldn't mind. Just leave the feed and come back again in a few minutes. Pat Rowan is at the top. Patricia McAteer, Desiree Riley. I can add all of you, but I can't add Morgan. So if maybe 1 or 2 of you. Morgan, if you want to comment, somebody said if you comment, here we go. You commented there. Can I bring you in because you commented? No, I still can't. It hasn't got. Oh, no, you've disappeared. Oh, there you go. There you are now. Right. Adding apologies for that, folks. Apparently, we can't use the word. I should at this point, just waiting for Morgan to return. I should at this point relate. I want to relate. Morgan is back, thankfully. I want to relate very quickly a story that happened. This is a real story. I have never seen The Good People, but I do not dismiss the belief in them at all. It's very strongly held with people. I, a few years ago, decided as an April Fool's joke that I was going to run a blog post on my website saying that Newgrange was going to be moved stone by stone to a different part of the Boyne Valley, closer to the river, and that in fact it was going to be put on a rotary platform so that it would move around to follow the sunrises through the course of the year, so that it would no longer only be aligned on winter solstice, that it could follow the sun. Now, believe it or not, some people fell hook, line and sinker for this and were very angry and were sharing the post saying, how dare the Irish government allow this to happen, blah, blah, blah. But I can tell you, within an hour of putting the post up, my website crashed quite severely and I was unable to recover it. Now, this wasn't my doing. I had my very best technical experts in the background on this, and they don't know what happened. It took about 2 days to recover the website back to full health. Needless to say, I deleted the post, and I never sort of took such a light-hearted view of the situation again. I assumed in my own mind that the 2 things were connected. I'm not sure if we were in the middle of you answering a question. We were talking about iron. Had we covered?
Talking about iron and its use protecting against fairies, and I got completely kicked off the feed. So
Patricia,
maybe they don't want that question answered.
Patricia Healy Sullivan asks, that a common portrayal of fairies is that they have wings. Of course, this is a sort of a more British and European thing, isn't it? Do Irish fairies ever have wings?
Well, I'm not going to dispute if people in modern Ireland were to see them that way, because people have their experiences, and I don't like devaluing personal anecdotal experiences. The thing about fairies and wings, in all of the older folklore, Irish and also non-Irish, fairies never have wings. They usually look fairly human. They can range in size between 18 inches tall to 6 feet tall. In Ireland, you kind of have the two different groupings. You have sort of the smaller, shorter ones, and then you have the human-sized looking ones. But they never have wings. And when we see accounts of them or hear accounts of them flying, they're usually flying through magical means, because they do. The Sluagh, of course, is well known to pass through the air, but they do not have wings. What happened, though, is in the 17th century and early 18th century, in theater, they started having actors wear wings to indicate that they were fairies, so that the audience would know basically what was happening. You wouldn't have to make a point of saying this particular character is supposed to be a fairy, because they would have butterfly wings or what have you. And then from there, it was taken into depictions and artwork. So then we see in the 18th and 19th century a lot of art showing fairies with wings and animalistic features and other things. And only after that do we start to see it in fiction. And then very, very recently, into the late 20th century, we start to see people having experiences or visions or what have you, where they claim to see fairies with wings. But it's actually an extremely modern thing when you really break it down as a belief that fairies actually had wings. It's very new. And yet it did pretty much come from England and the US to a lesser degree.
Yeah. Alwyn asks a question, and it's a good question. What language do the fairies speak?
This is a good question. Generally, it is said they will speak the language of whatever humans are living near them, and that they also have their own language that is sort of not understandable by humans. So it would be a completely separate kind of language. There's accounts of fairies, for example, who encountered someone in Ireland and initially speaks to them in Irish, and then the person doesn't have any Irish and says, I only speak English, and then they'll switch to speaking English. So it seems like they can be fairly flexible with the human languages, but then they also have something that's unique to them, if that makes sense. Yeah. And we have accounts of that in other places as well.
Yeah. This is a very, very good question. This is from Jules Cousins. Jules asks, have you had one experience or discovery that has wowed you?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Let me think. Yeah, I've definitely had some intense experiences myself, not involving technical snafus. So I would have to stop and really try to think of what some of those were. Have I, in researching, run across things? Definitely, because there's so much out there, I think, that we, in modern terms, take as just assumptions. Because, folklore being what it is, it's living and it's evolving and it changes. And then sometimes when you actually research something, you find out, like with the wings, that it's actually extremely new. Elves, fairies having pointed ears is another example of that. It's just sort of ubiquitous in a lot of depictions of them now, in stories and all of that. And that's actually extremely new as a matter of belief. Really only got popular after Tolkien. So,
yeah. Well, I suppose that's a discussion that. Oh, sure. Look, let's go there because we have time. That's something that I wanted to ask you personally: is how much has the modern, not belief, what it was, the modern culture around fairies sort of influenced the whole subject? I see regularly discussions on your own social media pertaining to, how much popular culture has infiltrated the belief in the fairies. And the best way to ask a question, I think, is actually to ask you, how do you think you can extract one from the other? Or is it inevitable now that you have, a chimera between the two, a synthesis of sort of modern culture intertwined with older beliefs?
I mean, the chimera may be something that we're just sort of stuck with at this point. I hope that they can be separated. The older beliefs, the folk beliefs, there's so much diversity to them, and there's so much power to them, and they're all so tied to specific places and specific people's experiences, and the whole body of it. It's really just such a beautiful thing, and I would hate to see that lost. When we look at what we're seeing in popular culture, what we're mostly dealing with is fiction, and I realize sometimes that can be a fine line in difference, but I think it's really important to understand that when we're talking about the traditional beliefs and folklore, we're talking about things that people actually believe, or believed if we're looking at the older accounts. These are things that they weren't made up. They weren't just a fun story to entertain people. They sort of reflect actual experiences that people have claimed to have that then get sort of passed on. When we're talking about fiction, particularly modern fiction, we're generally dealing with things that have been completely invented. And often when they're based on the folklore is only used as sort of window dressing to tell the wider story. And it really warps and changes in a lot of places, sometimes in a very awkward, kind of tone-deaf manner. And yet then people will take that and treat it like folklore and incorporate it into belief. And that's where the chimera comes in, and things get very awkward and complicated.
Your own insistence upon referring to the original and earliest sources is very interesting. Tell us a little bit about that. I know this is a tiny bit off the beaten track, but just a tiny bit. So much so, in fact, that you have taught yourself Old Irish. And one of the things that you do in your research, which I'm jealous of, I have to say, and I take my hat off to you, is that you are translating some of the Old Irish texts. For instance, you're hoping shortly to release a full translation of Cát Maith Tuath, which hasn't been done because the Stokes translation and the Gray translation have omitted parts of the text that are apparently too difficult to understand. What possesses one to try to teach oneself Old Irish?
That is an excellent question. Basically what happened is I wrote a book on...
We have another pause.
Yeah.
There we go.
Really,
it's okay. It's all right. You're back now.
I wrote a book on the Morgan in 2014, and I was sort of following up and doing some continuing research on that. And I found out that particularly the Stokes version of the Cát Maith Tuath, he not only didn't translate certain sections, but he also added material in certain places. And I got really mad about that. So I decided that the best way to understand what was actually being said would be to learn the language so that I could read it myself. Because I really didn't trust translations after that. So honestly, it was largely spite that motivated me.
Well, as I say, it is an incredible talent, and I'm really looking forward to seeing your complete translation of Cát Maith Tuath, because as we know from the episode that we did about Morgan and Maith Tuath, in which you were commenting, the role of Morgan, it could be said, was suppressed in that to an extent, that she's a much greater role. Lou is the one that comes out all shining as the one who kind of organizes the battle and defeats Balor and all the rest, without spoiling it for people. Let's get back on subject for a minute, because I think there's an entire different episode there. Perhaps we'll get you back in the future. There's so many questions that I want to make sure that I'm fair to people to give them a chance. Someone whose name I didn't take asks, Banshees and fairies, friends or foes?
Well, I want to address quickly a little misconception that I see really commonly now, which is the idea that fairies are a very specific type of thing. Fairy, generally, the English word fairy, it's a catch-all term for any sort of otherworldly being. It would be the Irish aes, she, Seoga, the equivalent would be fairies. When we talk about the banshee, banshee just literally means woman of fairy woman. They would be considered a type of fairy under that sort of broad category heading.
Yeah.
So when we look at fairies in Ireland, you would have the Menashe, the banshees. Puka would be a type of fairy. Leprechauns, not the modern sort of understanding of what leprechauns are, but we do find them in the older material, and they're actually a sort of a different type of thing, but they are there. All of those would be types of fairies that we would see. So if that answers the question, yeah, they wouldn't be against each other or in conflict. They would just be Banshee, Menashe would be a type of fairy.
I think I already know the answer to this one, but I'll let you answer it anyway. And it's from Angel, who asks, do you believe the fairies are the same race as the angels of the Bible?
That is a deep philosophical, theological, and cosmological question.
That's an episode all of its own.
It is, actually. There is certainly a lot of folklore that supports the belief. You had talked about earlier the idea of the Catholic sort of preserving and keeping the fairy belief alongside, clearly, Catholic beliefs. And that is an aspect of how that was done. If we look at the oldest material, the fairies are clearly not part of Christian cosmology. They are seen as being types of gods, types of spirits that are sort of outside that framework. But what ended up happening, particularly into I believe it was the 18th century when this idea got popular, was to incorporate it and not have a lot of conflict between the Christian beliefs and the fairy beliefs. We see the idea that fairies are fallen angels. And there's multiple versions to explain how this happened, but effectively that the angels who rebelled against God and were cast out end up in hell as demons. The angels that stayed neutral during the war in heaven were also cast out as a punishment, but because they weren't bad enough to become demons and to go to hell, they became fairies and were sort of trapped, more or less, in this world.
One of the stories that we read in the past few episodes began by saying that it is said that the fairies were not good enough for heaven, but too good for hell. So they were trapped here on earth. Thanks for that, Morgan. Just a few more questions. Marion wants to know, can the fair folk come to us in our dreams? Now, I would have, my own view on that would have been absolutely yes. And if you've read Joseph Campbell, you'll know that Joseph Campbell says that, and Joseph Campbell and C.G. Jung were great friends, that myths are public dreams and that dreams are private myths. But anyway, I'll let you address the question. That's from Marion. Can the fair folk come to us in our dreams?
I would fully agree with your answer, Anthony. Yes, they can. There's actually quite a long history in folklore of people having encounters with the fair folk in dreams, or having encounters with humans who've been taken by the good neighbors in dreams. So we definitely see a lot of basis for that, and it is something I would personally believe as well. Again, it's interesting to note that prior to the last about 150 years, dreams were always sort of considered to be something that had a reality to it, that when you dreamed, there was substance to it, something had actually occurred. It wasn't until psychology came in that we start to see really strongly the idea that dreams are just the human mind talking to itself. But for all of history prior to that, Western history prior to that, it was always believed that dreams were something more, were your spirit encountering something.
Yeah, and there's a related question. I'm apologies. I'm trying to type quietly because I know that people can hear the keyboard. There's a related question and from somebody whose name I didn't note. Do they shout in your ear to wake you, especially if there's trouble? I thought that was a very good question.
They certainly can, and we do have anecdotal accounts and people's experiences that back up, audibly hearing them, not in the sense of, hallucinating hearing voices, but, hearing music, fairies passing by. And there have been accounts of people who have heard it like it was a right in their ear type of thing, for various purposes. Whether it's to help you or not would depend on the circumstance, I think.
Yeah, I was just looking out the window. My blackbird visitor is back, but this time she has her male partner with her. There's a brown and a black blackbird outside cavorting around the yard, which is wonderful to see. In relation to the earlier, and again, I didn't take a note who this was, in relation to the leprechaun, there are several different versions of the story. We heard one in our recent episodes about it being related to 1 foot la corpa or something like that. The story that I heard and that I have great affection for is that after the Gael, after the Milesians took Ireland and the Dé Dananns retreated into the Shee and under the ground into the hollow hills, that the god Lu was under the ground at Ishnach, and that such was the great burden of carrying the world above him that he shrank and became a much smaller man. And that there's two versions in the Lu Cromán, which is, I think, little stooping Lu, and Lu Corpán, the little body of Lu. Where in your view is the truth likely to lie with the origin of the leprechaun?
Well, and as I said, folklore is something that is constantly evolving and adapting. So we can sort of see a progression from studying the really older mythology and stories into studying the more recent stories. So I definitely think there's value in the newer stories. When we look at the oldest material, which would go back to, I believe it's the 9th century, the Extra Fergus Machleti, the leprechaun, which at that point in Older Irish was Luchapan, which again, Lu in Old Irish means small or little. And I'm going to have a linguistic nerd moment. The word Lu is L-U. The god's name in Older Irish is L-U-G.
Lug, yeah.
So they would have been different at the time, just to be clear. Lu being small, Corpan meaning little-bodied, so kind of emphasizing that they were very small. And they appear as this sort of water sprite, or water fairy, if you will. They're about 18 inches tall. They actually try to drown the main character to drag him into the water. And he succeeds in defending himself and captures them instead, and then they have to promise him certain things in order for him to release them, including giving him the ability to breathe underwater, which is probably a smart thing to ask for under those circumstances.
Early version of scuba diving. I like that.
Yeah, magical scuba diving. But when we look at the leprechauns, the Luchapan, in those older stories, again, this is 9th century, we see certain things that are definitely connected to the more modern stories. The size, the idea that they sort of grant wishes, is not directly the older story, but it's that concept of he defeats them, so they have to give him something. in exchange.
It's really curious that you should say that, because the very next question from Raymond Lawson was, do fairies grant wishes? What a coincidence.
Rare circumstances.
Yeah.
And they in the older story were potentially dangerous. There's another account where their king gets captured, I think by the King of Ulster. And so the rest of the leprechauns, because they live in a whole society. They have bards, they have warriors, they're just, 18 inches tall, sort of go on rampage through the country and are burning things down and ruining crops, and, because they want their king back.
Yeah.
So that's the really classic older leprechaun that we see in the mythology. And then certainly around, I think it's 1850 in writing, where we start to see the newer, the shoemaker, kind of usually solitary male leprechaun coming up into folklore.
Yeah, I don't know why it is, Morgan, that, as I say, the story of Lugh being burdened, almost like Atlas carrying the world, just seems to have a ring of truth to it for me. And I suppose this demonstrates the subjective area of interpretation of mythology, because everybody gets their own thing from it. And perhaps that's what's intended when a story is first told. I want to ask you some advice. If you happen to be walking down the road at night time on your own, down a boreen in Ireland, and it's dark, and you happen to either hear merry music from beyond the ditch, or you see little lights dancing around the place, or you see little figures flitting around in the darkness, what advice would you give to us based upon your vast knowledge of fairy lore? What is the very best thing a person could do in that circumstance?
The very best thing you could do probably is try to get inside fairly quickly.
Oh, not inside the fairy fort or whatever. Inside as in indoors. Yeah,
inside a human habitation or a car. Lots of iron in cars. When we look at situations like that, there's a lot of advice about not wandering at night, not going out alone, particularly near rivers or around the west side of things. If you're in a situation where you definitely are having some issues, things like turning your coat inside out, carrying some iron or bread with you are protective. Generally, when you hear fairy music or you see them or have that sort of encounter, when we look at the anecdotal material, and there's a whole lot of this on Duachus.ie, for example, which I highly recommend people look at. It's a wonderful website.
I'll type that in as a comment, actually, while you're talking, so that people can follow that. Yeah, brilliant idea. Thanks.
There's a lot of accounts of people who saw them or ran across them and attempted to engage them in a friendly manner, we'll put it that way, and ended up basically not having a good experience, getting beaten or, driven through the night, waking up in a different county the next morning, having spent the night as a fairy horse. I mean, stories like that. So just because you're seeing them or hearing music doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to go well for you, unless you're a musician. They do tend to like musicians.
Yeah.
In the stories.
One from the Boyne Valley, Morgan. I hope the viewers will forgive me asking a few of my own questions. In relation to Doubt, there's a story there which I believe might be a Victorian era story, and it's very similar to the story of the Pied Piper, about a guy who was playing pipes or a whistle, and he led all the children underground, and they haven't been seen since. Is that basically a fairy story?
I would interpret it as a fairy story, yeah. The idea that they take people, particularly children, is embedded throughout the folklore. And the idea that they use music is another thing that we see. Generally, when you hear fairy music, unless you are a musician yourself, it usually is not a good thing. The way when people experience it, Obviously, there's exceptions to that, but usually.
Actually, if you would forgive me, I will read it. It's on my own bloody it's on my own website, and I had forgotten. There is a legend told of an old piper who entered this vast monument about a century ago. Of course, this is probably written in the 20th century, so probably relates to the 19th, with a party of young men and women on an exploring excursion, I suppose, and they give him a name, Darby the Blast. Was a bit of a virtuoso. Well, 'twas a fine summer's morning in the month of July, and Darby entered first, playing his most sprightly tune, The Humours of Glyn, with variations. But poor Darby and his friends were doomed never to return. But the people heard from them, for the old piper was heard busily playing underground at Stanleon, it says here, which is Stalleen, on the opposite side of the river. Probably that was Darby's last tune, for from that day to this he has never been heard of.
Yeah, they usually let musicians go, but not always. There's actually an account in the school's collection of a fiddler, I think it was, who, as he was dying, confessed to his family, because he had been blinded in one eye and no one had ever known how that had happened, confessed to his family that he had seen a group of fairies playing hurley one night as he was walking, and they had wanted him to join them, and he ended up agreeing to it. But then one of the fairy women didn't want him to leave, and was offering him fairy food, which, as I hope we all know, you should never eat food the fairies offer you. So he wouldn't eat it because he knew that if he did, he'd be trapped and have to go with them. And she was so angry at the refusal that she struck him and blinded him in one eye. And then he'd gone the rest of his life like that, and only told his family as he was dying what had actually happened.
Yeah.
Because sometimes you just want to keep a person.
Yeah. I at this point we're over the hour mark. I was going to say I'll take two more questions which I have here from viewers before we wrap up. I have a feeling there's quite a substantial number of viewers who've stayed on. Normally what we see is about 200 at the start and it goes down to about 100 at the end. There's actually 193 people watching on Facebook right now and a further 46 on YouTube. Alan Aubrey, I hope I have the name right, asks, if you were hypothetically a changeling raised as or by a human, what do you think the innate attributes would be of a changeling? Very good question, I think.
Well, changeling lore is a huge, huge topic. We could probably have an entire hour just talking about changelings. I will assume from the question that we're talking specifically about infants, because changelings would include various adults. But generally, if you have an infant or a child who is taken by the fair folk, the human child goes to be with the fairies. The fairies leave a substitute in the child's place. Sometimes the substitute is an inanimate object that's been glamoured, been magic to look like the baby.
Well, we had a stick last night, this story about the Donegal people who came down to Dublin to stay in Stephen's Green, took the daughter away and left a stick in its place that turned into a changeling, yeah.
Yep, exactly. There's an account as well, I think, up around Sligo of a new mother who a neighbor, sees her being taken off and rescues her from the fairies, and then leaves her at his house and goes to her house and finds everyone crying and keening and mourning because they think she's passed. And he goes in and he sees a log, a length of wood, in the bed where everyone else is, saying the woman's body is, and he kind of realizes what has happened. And that would be another example of a changeling story. Of course, eventually, he tells them to burn the log, and they do, and then the woman's able to come back. But when we're looking at attributes of changelings with infants and children, it's usually the child will noticeably physically change. It looks like the same, suddenly very sickly. They become very demanding, often constantly hungry, constantly crying. But they can be tricked into revealing their nature because they're usually not actually a child. So there's a lot of folklore about, boiling water in an eggshell so that the fairy changeling will say, oh, I'm 1,000 years old and I've never seen that before, sort of a thing.
We had the eggshells, we had that one last night, I think, yeah.
Yep.
And one more question.
Story. It's a good one.
Yeah, it is. One more question, and this is from one of our regulars, Paul Gowron. Do you believe, Morgan, that Biddy Early would have had a supremely strong connection to the fairies?
I think I lost you there for a second.
Okay, that's okay. Do you want me to repeat the question?
If you could, please.
Yeah, no problem. Paul Gowron asks, do you believe if Biddy Early would have had a supremely strong connection to the fairies?
There's two, of course, schools of thought to that. One being that it was her dead son, that his spirit was helping her and guiding her. The other that it was the fairies. I tend to favor the idea that it was the fairies because she fits this wider pattern that we see of the Manafasa, the wise women who learned some of their skill or some of their healing knowledge from the fairies. And we have a lot of accounts of that. There's a really good book called The Book of the Kayak, which talks about some of the 18th and 19th century Manafasa wise women. And it talks about many of them were known to have fairy connection, to be away with the fairies. And that was how they would get their foreknowledge of events that hadn't happened or their cures. So I personally tend to put Biddy Early myself in that category. But I know that there's many diverse opinions when it comes to her. So,
as there are on many things relating to folklore and mythology and everything we've been talking about, a lot of commentary over the past hour or so saying thank you, Morgan. A lot of very praiseworthy commentary. And I think you'll all join me in thanking Morgan for, first of all, agreeing to come on Live Irish Myths as our first joint guest, and secondly, for addressing all the questions really brilliantly. I'm very glad we've had you on, Morgan, because I just wouldn't have been in a position to answer a lot of those questions because I don't have the depth of knowledge that you have. So I want to say thank you very much on behalf of everybody. We're at 1 hour and 12, so we'll probably leave it there. We may get you back. There's a lot of talk about an episode about the Morrigan, and I think that's another one I would like. Separate to the discussion we had about Caught My Chura, is that we need to have an episode about Morrigan, and that's one I think that we'd greatly appreciate your input in. If I could just say before we finish, folks, Morgan runs a fabulous blog, which she updates regularly. That's lairvaughan.blogspot.com. I'm pasting that in as a link now. Please do take the time to have a look at her Amazon author page. You will be exceedingly impressed at her literary output, as I constantly am. So I'm just copying also a link to her Amazon author page. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, if you feel like supporting Morgan, she also has a Patreon account, and that's patreon.com/Morgan Daimler. And I'm pasting that in there as well. I want to say apologies to anybody whose questions I did not get round to answering. I was trying to concentrate on what Morgan was saying and at the same time record the questions. I hope that what was asked was a good representation of the topic. As Morgan has said, I think we could probably spend many hours discussing this topic, and we may actually come back to it. In the meantime, Morgan, just to say again, thanks a million for coming along tonight. I have thoroughly enjoyed this, and it's been a learning experience for me.
Well, thanks for having me. Thank you all for putting up with the technical difficulties. And it was a great conversation. Lots of good questions.
Yeah. And to the YouTubers, no complaints about being able to hear you, so that's good. One person asked me not to type so loud at the beginning, and that was completely understandable. But As I always do to close out an episode, I just remind people that we are still in the middle of a pandemic. Just to keep yourself safe by washing your hands regularly, use hand sanitizer if you're outdoors, or if you're out anywhere other than at home, try and maintain some sort of social distancing. And of course, when you're going into any sort of a place where there's a crowd, wear a face mask that covers your nose and your mouth. Keep safe and keep coming back. Morgan, thank you so much for being our first joint guest on Live Irish Myths. You've been fabulous, and of course I knew you would be, and hopefully we'll see you on here again soon.
Thank you very much for having me. I had a really good time. Brilliant.
In the meantime, Ichawa Nadine Golair Kolosov August Slán Gafol. Thanks a million. This is Live Irish Myths. I've been Anthony Murphy, and this has been Morgan Daimler. Thanks, Morgan.